30 years, you think, wow, she only looks 30. I do want to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me here to participate in this conference, and it's a quite interesting conference in the way, I was just saying, the way it's mixing actual pedagogical practices with more conventional lectures, and then some of us get assigned the very conventional, boring lecturing part. And of course, I would like to thank the first and ongoing peoples who struggle to keep this place in place. I want to begin the talk today, what I'm going to talk about today, by just framing it a little bit and saying that I've extracted parts of what I'm going to say today from a book, indeed, I'm trying to finish, called Geontology, Requiem to Late Liberalism. And in a really condensed form, the argument goes something like this, that we're no longer, if we think about late liberal governance, or for those of us in the room who work in settler colonies, especially in the English Commonwealth of settler colonies, my claim is that we're no longer in biopolitics, that the formation of power that we've called biopower or biopolitics is not actually what we're in right now. That is, the governance through the tension or difference between life and death, whether we say making live and letting die and killing, or we think in sovereignty in terms of letting live and killing, is not actually what's the formation of power that's pressing in on us and that we find ourselves in, but rather the formation of power that we seem to be in right now is perhaps better called geontological power. That is, we're finding that biopolitics now is not only governing through life and death, because even biopolitics lets die as part of its form, but rather the governance of the difference between life and non-life. And biopolitics is actually part of what allows that distinction between those things that are alive and those things that are not dead, they're just non-life. Biopolitics allows that distinction to remain in place and to be a distinction, a difference that makes a difference. And I'm saying that actually that difference is, in some ways, crumbling. As a result, and this is something that I was, that actually Myra Hurd's work has really helped me think through, instead of the four figures of sexuality being the figures and discourses and tactics that's relevant to the contemporary period, and remember that's the, hopefully we can do it by rote, it's the masturbating child, and that's relevant to this conference. The hysterical woman, and since that's also very relevant, clearly around here. The Malthusian couple and the perverse adult, right? So those were the four discourses and figures through which biopolitics or biopower worked for Foucault. And instead, although, again, sexuality is still relevant, there's actually three other figures that I think are more relevant to what this thing is that we're finding ourselves in. And those three figures, and again, they're figures, they're not actual social forms that exist outside of power, they're figures of power, they're expressing power. And these three figures would be something like the desert, that is, that which once had life but is denuded of life. There are a bunch of things that cluster under that figure. The animist, or the indigenous, or the recycling subject. And there's a lot of figures, and that's the figure, again, a liberal figure in which there is no, we don't have to worry about non-life because everything's life. So the extension of life, and we also see this in the new vitalisms. And the third, the virus, that which refuses the distinction or says the distinction makes the difference makes no difference. Now, again, these are, I'm talking about late liberal figures that are trying to manage power right now, rather than the actual existence that exists as an otherwise to that power. So I think it's really important. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about loosely fits in that bridge. No, I'm just going to start. Okay. In 2008, 25 Indigenous friends, family, and colleagues of mine and I began the process of registering the Cotabing Indigenous Corporation with the Office of the Registrar of Indigenous Corporations. So there's a whole bureaucracy around this. The original goal of the incorporation was to be able to receive funds to build a digital archive run off smartphones and smart tablets, in which files, media files, would be geotagged. You guys know geotag, given a longitude and a latitude. So that the media files could only be played proximate to the place to which they referred. This digital archive would have two major interactive divisions, one for the members of the Cotabing, and one for non-members and specifically, as imagined, potential tourists to the Cotabing's country. Now, the creation of this digital archive came at a very particular moment, that is 2008. And 2008 was a period in which two things, of course, were happening. The culmination, by this time, the culmination was certain liberal politics of cultural recognition, and here we have to remember what Maria Baptiste said yesterday, cultural recognition, through the technologies of land claims as authored by the state, not indigenous communities, had created all sorts of divisions within actual indigenous communities, causing serious tensions within them. And the 25 members of the Cotabing had been living at Belyuen, and the tension that a long-standing land claim had placed inside the community caused a number of violences that these members decided to leave the community, so that was one. And at the same time, exactly when they were thinking, how do we shift back to another country, the federal state declared an intervention in Indigenous affairs. For those of you who are not Australian, this intervention pivoted on a public sex panic around the supposed sexual abuse of Aboriginal children by in Indigenous communities. And on the basis of this public panic, the federal government rewrote and reimagined the way in which Indigenous people would be governed in Australia. In particular, a series of land takeovers, community takeovers, the introduction of police, the military, etc. So this project, this media project, really was built out of these two tensions. And what the Cotabing were imagining was that, on the one hand, they would have this division for their kids and for themselves, and I'll talk about that in a second. But on the other hand, for people visiting the country, in particular tourists. So for them, they thought, imagine someone preparing for a trip to the far north, Australia, while these non-Cotabing members, presumably white, were researching the area online. The person would discover the Cotabing website that highlighted various points of interest to this person. For a fee, that person would download the media that had been geotagged related to those places she was going to travel. Later, she would be floating on a boat or walking across somewhere, and she would activate her smartphone, open the application, hold up her smartphone and see either a video or some other piece of media through her camera lens as she's looking at the place too, so it's laminated on top. You all know these things now. As she moved the phone around, she would see various icons representing stories or videos that would be available to her. She could touch one of those, and maybe she would get a story. And indeed, one of the things that she might hear as she was standing in this place that seemed to be open and without people is a person saying to her, the place you're standing on is still my country. Now, When one asked the Academy, because the Academy would go around and talk about the project with various people that they thought might have money to finance it, they would be asked, what is this project for? And they would say three things. One, as an alternative to mining their country. Right? So, under the extraordinary economic duress in which they live as a racialized community and set of people, they are thinking hard about how actually do we live in the world without buying into it. There's one ready at hand means of producing, which is to mine their country. In the north, there's a lot of pressure to do that. So the first thing they say is in order to have, and have said, is in order to generate a means of taking care of ourselves and our kids without having to mine on our country. The second thing they say is that they're doing it for their kids, and in particular, their interests, at least the adults in Cotabing, say that they watch their kids are way into new media like all kids are, and they're thinking of the media project, this augmented, what we would call an augmented reality project or a digital archive, as a way of engaging their kids in the actual continuation of minding and taking care of and repeating the country. Right? So it's a way of hooking their kids into being in country and being oriented to country. Now, that was 2008. By 2014, the Cotabing Indigenous Corporation had morphed, for the most part, into a film collective. To date, it has completed 2 films. The first one, Cotabing Low Tide Turning, premiered at the 62nd Berlinale in 2002. It's been shown at the Wexner Arts Center. It's been shown at Documenta 13. These are all at the Festival of Films, etc. And then the Berlinale has moved it around in Madagascar, in Hanoi, and then they ran it for a month on their online site. So you say that's great. Their second film, which we'll show tonight, called When the Dogs Talked, was completed in February of 2014 and is going to be screened at the Gertrude in Melbourne, at the Institute of Modern Art in Brisbane, and other places. And indeed, we just finished shooting the third film, The Waves, that will begin editing. Cotabing films that emerged, and I should say something about them. So Cotabing films emerged from a simple observation about the contemporary lives of members. So Cotabing members, the way these films are created is that someone will observe something about their life. For instance, a couple of the adults said, well, it's kind of hard in the current, it was about 2011, 2010 when we started doing this. They said, under the intervention, there's all this pressure to move into the cities, and under the politics of recognition, there's all this pressure for us to maintain our traditional life, but in the bush. But in fact, neither living in the city nor living in the bush is really workable. They both present very different kinds of problems to actually producing the kinds of lives we want. And both of them are especially precarious in the wake of this federal intervention. And they observed, and some of the adults observed, that their kids, in particular, struggle to make sense of how their families' knowledge and analytics of the land and each other fit into contemporary understandings of, say, evolution, the soundscapes of hip-hop, and the technologies of mining and land development. And then, so that Cotabing take that observation, and then they shape these observations into a plot. For instance, the plot that you'll see later tonight goes like this. A family tries to find a missing relative in order not to lose their public housing in the city, but then wind up stranded in their outstation in the bush because they run out of petrol and their car breaks down. And as the adults have to decide whether to try and rush back to the city and save their public housing, or continue this augmented reality project in the bush, their young kids and teenage kids struggle to decide how the dreaming or this living landscape still makes sense in their contemporary lives. The elements then of the plot and the actual acting out of the plot are drawn from actual events, so that the films come from observing, analyzing, and then when the plot's actually written, loosely written, it's written through things that actually happened. Right? Maybe not in the order that they happen in the film, but that actually happened. For the most part, then everyone plays some version of him or herself, although a few Codabing members play characters they've interacted with a lot. For instance, you'll see some Codabing act out field officers for Northern Territory housing, so they play housing officials, which they know very well. Everyone that says or does things they've said or done before, although these sayings and doings are put in a slightly new context. In other words, the Codabing are acting, even if they're acting themselves and their reality. So it's an interesting double layer. Now, from one point of view, the Codabing are traveling the wrong way on the media highway. From new media, where they started, to old media. Everyone knows film is dead, both aesthetically and financially. And while it's true that the Codabing continued to conceptualize the intimate relationship between the archive project as this new media project, geotag it, plays proximate, spherical, and the film project, so they conceptualize it's still an intimate relationship between the two. That's certainly true, and I can talk about a recent proposal they put in which they say we're going to have this long form, so you shoot the new film we did, shoot the long one, and then you break it up in ways that you could actually have it as a plot that you have to follow in the landscape, or you could have 3 screens and throw it showed in galleries, and etc. Nevertheless, there's still this interesting, if you were in media, you would say that's weird, they're going the wrong direction. Now there are many ways of approaching the errant media trajectory of the Codabing. One approach would explore the relevance, actually, of the distinction between old and new media. You'd say, what's the distinction here anyways? Technology studies sometimes emphasize the storage and transmission end, if they're thinking old and new media. That is, old is analog and new is digital. Others place emphasis on the interactive nature of the new media, basically everything post-Web 2.0. That said, everything that the Codabing were thinking about producing has a digital platform operated by digital software. So we shot the waves on a digital Sony F3, on iPhones, on the GoPro. We downloaded the footage and sound on hard drives. We edit on Final Cut. We circulate cuts through Dropbox. So we circulate back and forth across national state borders, through the cloud. We project off digital DVD and Blu-ray projectors. We envision cut-ups, mashups, and trans-ups into the future. So the young kids and the older and me, and we're all like, who knows what about what kind of coming media. But the films aren't interactive from a viewer's point of view, even the ones that were going to be on that little smartphones. Though they're not passive, they're never, and it's important to remember, nothing's passive. You thumb it up now on the media, thumb it down, you circulate it, you clap, and you don't clap. Another way, so that's one way of approaching, like, why are we going in, they and I, going in the wrong direction? Another way of approaching this errant trajectory would remain technologically focused, but now focusing on the conditions that various discursive material infrastructures place on the media form as a condition of its circulation, so it allows it to move. Now I'll come back to this, but let me note briefly that our digital archive media wouldn't have to be marked by a GPS location, by a media type, by a file, and etc. The organization and size of the database, this is all things that condition what we would be doing. So there's a lot of conditions even when we talk about the, quote, new media. But I would actually put all those technological or science and technology studies, primarily science and technology study way of looking at this path aside, and instead actually think about 2 other perspectives. And the first one has to be, would look at the media adventures from the perspective of shifting forms of contemporary capital. So if we say, look, this division between the old and new media really doesn't work here, it's a difference that doesn't make any difference. What if we thought about what the Economy were doing from the perspective of contemporary capital? Then the Economy could be seen as participating in what Hart and Negri would call immaterial labor. For them, remember, the concept of immaterial labor refers to the informationalization of capital that came about when the service sector broke free from the service sector. Right? So the use of the service sector used to be in one place, and now for them it defines all of capitalism. Right? And the reason it does for them is that an information communication network is what defines the actual value of the labor today. Now, it doesn't matter when it comes to the informationalization of capital, what the concrete technology is. So all sorts of technologies of information collection are deployed in the contemporary period, including algorithms that mine my buying and your buying habits, paper slips that are distributed in hotels marked "Give us feedback," Facebook and Twitter feeds, all of it. What matters for Hart and Negri are not the material technologies of this new informationalized capital and thus immaterial labor. What matters is the heart of this, supposedly, this new logic of labor. Affective for them, these affective informational loops oriented toward capturing the desire of the other so that capital can insinuate itself ever more exactly, ever more anticipatorily into the desire of the other. So it can anticipate what you want and get in there even before you can articulate what it is. And that's why the collection of all the data and then the crunching with big data. That is, this new kind of capitalism, according to Hart and Negri, does not seek to antagonize, and it doesn't stage an antagonism of desire, out of which the Hegelians would posit unfolds the world history, beginning with the original antagonism. Instead, informational capitalism seeks to anticipate our desire, not to antagonize it. Now, rather than viewing immaterial labor, and this is what he's saying that capital is now, it's immaterial labor, but rather than seeing it as the last locked door of the prison house of capital, Hart and Negri see immaterial labor as providing, quote, the potential for a kind of spontaneous and elementary communism within capital. This is for the simple reason that they see cooperation, this cooperation that they somehow see in these feedback loops of this information affect. And it's mutual-oriented affect. That is, I'm looking at you to try and figure out what you want. I really want to know what you want. And the hallmarks, they see this as the hallmark qualities of elementary communism. And they see it as completely imminent to the laboring activity of immaterial labor, as opposed to what they see as the previous forms of laboring capital, which they understand as dependent on coordination of parts, right? So it's not about coordinated parts, but at the heart of it, they say it's about cooperation and orientation toward the other. So they want to radicalize that. No matter what we think of Hart and Negri's writing of the history of capital, we can make use of one aspect of their work, I think, for the purpose of this conference. Namely, what are the media practices of the economy intending to do? That is, what's the purpose of them? And here I want to turn to the title of this conference, Learning How to Inherit in Colonized and Ecologically Challenged Lifeworlds. And I should note that actually an announcement of the conference on the University of Victoria website left out the "in." So it's Learning How to Inherit Colonized and Ecologically Challenged Lifeworlds, which I thought was really cool. So it's not in them, it's inheriting, how to inherit them. Now, hopefully, as I'm going to make more concrete as I go along, I'm putting the emphasis on the First, learning how to inherit, like learning how to inherit, learning how, the first two words, versus to inherit, learning how to. And I want to think about this learning how in relation to these media practices in the context of a settler imaginary that's already there, that already governs the economy, and already characterizes what inheritance is. Right? And here again, we go to what I think Maria was really importantly talking about yesterday for those of us who were there. That is, what they're inheriting within this settler imaginary and its governance is by and large understood as culture, as something that has a content, right, that you can characterize, and then you can measure over time. So it's all about change over time. And thus, in these colonized and ecologically challenged worlds, the to inherit is already built in this machinery of governance, in which part of the problem is what is that thing being inherited, and who gets to govern what it is. And what does it have to do with learning how? This is the reason I want to put this emphasis on this is because the dichotomy analytic, and again, I really want to underline this. I don't know how many times I'm going to underline it, but dichotomy or analyzing the world. It's a form of knowing. It's an epistemological practice. It's not a cultural repetition. And from the dichotomy analytic, sees learning how as constituting the world that one then inherits. I don't need to make that trickier than it is, but I think the grammar is really important. The learning how, see the learning how, the way one learns, as constituting the world that then one inherits. The world's not there irrespective of the mode of learning, but is constituted out of the mode of learning, and thus the object being inherited is dependent in some ways, in critical ways, on this mode of learning. It's a mode of relating and being obligated. Thus, rather than beginning with media and technology, right, as, you know, like, whoa, look at this. We started here and landed up here. What about the technology? What about instead, I think what's important is to frame, that I want to stay in the frame of the conference and ask how and whether this transformation from new to old media matters at all from the perspective of the conference's thematic. But rather what might matter instead is what this media is doing relative to this notion of learning how, as constituting the world that media inherits. Okay. What then is, all I really want to talk about is what's the purpose of knowledge? If you think about inheriting knowledge, what's the purpose of knowledge? What is the object or end of knowledge? When asked this way, I don't think the end of knowledge is, and again, this is, I think, part of this epistemological framework that actually is part of the governance of power. That is, the answer is not truth. What is the purpose of knowledge? Truth. I think it's something slightly different. So let's start. And let's start with some meta-discursive ground rules. When I ask what the purpose of knowing is for many of my economy colleagues, I'm not seeking to describe the cultural beliefs about people in place. I'm not interested in measuring the change of cultural beliefs over time. I'm not interested in, and nor are they, I should say, the degree of divergence between them and their parents, or their parents and their parents. That old anthropological caliper has to really be locked away in a jar. Or just, I don't know, maybe we can extinguish it. The question is not what is their culture and how is it changing, but what is the nature of existing existence, and how can these existences establish or maintain their normative force in the world? That is, how can one keep the world as one wants the world to be, keep going in the world? That is a very different question than what's their culture or what's our culture. Put another way, It's not, the point isn't belief about X, Y, and Z, thus, and the measure between the belief about X, Y, and Z and the truth of it, because we can measure the truth by all the epistemologies of science, and then we can say, well, they kind of get it true. But rather, what methods do we use, and Cotter can say, what kind of methods do we use to know the nature of contemporary existence so that we can figure out how to maintain that existence we want into the present and continuation. So, one of the things we have to say is exactly what is the nature of that existence that we're trying to continue, and what might be, or they're trying to continue, what might that have to do with the kinds of media projects that they are making. Take, for instance, a set of conversations in 2006 that happened with friends at Bellion about this potential archive. So go back to the new media, which we first started with. I remember we were working on, we were sitting down and we were thinking what was going to go into this archive. And we were all just collectively pulling in the stories that we had each been individually given, or not, over the last, and that would have been 2006, I don't know, 28 years. 20 years. And as we were going back and forth about a particular place, I remembered an event that had happened maybe 10 years earlier. So I was camping at a particular location called Bogo with some older women who had, by the time of 2006, were deceased, and who had been aunts and mothers and grandmothers of the Cotter working on this project. And we had gone there to hunt for freshwater turtles, visit relatives living nearby, and add texture to the long run of days. This was in 1996. Everyone who had gone down there on that trip had agreed that we all had been locked up at Bellion for too long and needed to stretch our legs. Of course, no one had been locked up at Bellion community in the sense that they had been legally imprisoned. Since the 1970s, but only really since the 1970s, Indigenous men and women were free to move around the nation and consume the nation on the same footing as all other citizens. As for stretching our legs, we hardly walked to Bogo. After a 4-hour drive in a rough gutted road in a flatbed truck, our legs and backs were actually much worse shape than they had been before we started. What I was remembering as we're all sitting around talking about this one little area about what we could stick in there or not stick in there in this media project was a particular morning, because you always remember the bad things, or the uncomfortable things, and it was August, in this big Bogo in August, there was a thick morning fog on the land, or chelbak, which we call it. Chelbak is fog. And still, nevertheless, all the mosquitoes were out in numbers, which at this place has a very unworldly feel about it. It's really, there's mosquito dreaming around the corner, and they're really big, and it's like, it's surreal. And in any case, on that morning, I was tasked with emerging from my mosquito net to make a morning fire. So the firewood we had collected was wet, so you have to peel underneath to try and get some dry stuff. And two of the older women were sitting inside of their mosquito nets watching me do this and getting eaten alive by mosquitoes. I had a Bic lighter, and I always kept saying, can't I just break this bloody Bic lighter and just pour it on the thing and light it on fire and get this fire going? And of course the two women who were sitting on under the net said no, I had to do it the proper way. Making a small fire from dry little bits of barks in the building into a larger fire that then dries the wood as it burns. Now, they insisted partly to punish me, because that's what older people did with younger people back then, for fun. Because why not? Partly to encourage my education, so they were like, no, we're encouraging your education. And partly from watching a young white woman be saddled with a really nasty chore that nobody wanted to do. And partly because they were thinking about the cigarettes they wanted to light with that big lighter. Now, to make the task seem something other than a heinous chore, and certainly because she was always supplemented, she was always like this. Youngie, who's a credible person, pointed, as I'm doing this, she pointed to this thick tubular fog moving around a nearby hill and said, you know, that thing's alive. One thing I said, that thing that looks like a snake, it's alive. If you go there, it smells you, you know, swallow you up, don't go there. And that part of the fall, the shellback she was pointing to really did look like this huge, it was, you know, this huge snake-like movement through the striated layers of foam. And I'd seen this form of shellback many times before. It's often on creeks. I mean, we've all seen it. And I was hardly surprised that the primary sense apparatus that Yoni ascribed to this shellback snake was smell. Nor that she said that the shellback snake was very sensitive and reacted to differences between human smells. So, you know, she was like, it's going to smell you, you're going to get swallowed up. The answer of what shellback was came from observations about what shellback did in different environments, with environments understood as thick assemblages of forms of existence. So we knew this about, or Yoni knew this about shellback, because Yoni watched shellback over time for a very long time, and gathering knowledge about what it's likely to do. Thus, the questions people like Yoni asked about shellback and other existence like shellback, so there are all kinds of these things, of course, had to do with what an existence that is here and existing is liable to do in relation to who, over time, in what context. That is, how did existence react to different kinds of existence? Racialized existence, territorialized existence, human, non-human, rock, river, wind. Now, the point was, the more you encounter something, the deeper your sense of the range of behavior that something, whether, again, a human, a rock, a shellback, a wind, the deeper your sense of the range of behavior that any existence was capable of expressing, but also the tendencies of things, again, human, non-human, wind, whatever, the tendencies of any particular thing, the tendency of one particular thing or another to do something rather than something else, right? So you really pay quite careful attention to it. When asking about the meaning or significance of something, their children and I were constantly urged to turn our queries to experience and to be open to the quirky nature of all forms of existence. Not quirky in the sense of a stochastic process that is, you know, statistically over time, what does wind do, right? But instead, really looking and thinking through the ways in which beings are. So Earl yesterday, for those of you who were there when we talked about particular plants that like particular places, it's that attention to forms of existence and how to keep them in place and nurture. That is, all existence, including humans, were dynamic, and like any person and non-person has a personality. They have a tendency to behave in certain ways, but also to surprise a person. And so people sought out others. They knew who had long experience with specific forms of beings, like shellback and others. Then they put their heads together in often competitive, status-enhancing or diminishing conversations. Just what we were doing, thinking about what would go in the GPS project. Right. But the other things that they'll talk to their kids and to me together was that in the process of coming to know, by paying attention, by thinking that things aren't homogeneous but rather have tendencies, is that in the process of coming into intimate knowledge and contact in order to see what existences are likely to do relative to different other kinds of existences, was the fact that in knowing, the two changed over time internally. And this is really quite important. That is, and it was very material. As one came to be in a place and knowing a place, part of the person and part of the place substituted relations. Literally, peeing, shitting, sweating, talking, all went into country, came out of country, went into people, came out of country, went into people, came out of country. That is, not in an abstract belief system, but rather in an attentive relation to material forms of becoming together. In ways I think we were talking about just recently. Thus, even with shellback, that fall snake that Lily pointed to me, saying, watch out for that, was becoming different, even as Yili and I and others, and certainly people sitting at the GPS conversation, were themselves becoming otherwise together. What does that mean? Simply, in some very straightforward way, air, geology, what we call life and non-life, was changing shape and smell and sound. And that is, we were changing too. Again, differentially, because of how we were apprehended by forms of settler governments. But everyone was changing little by little, and then sometimes a lot. For instance, diets had changed. The diet of the women that I was camping with changed perhaps most dramatically in the short period between 1890, when settlement really started digging in, to 1970, and then to 1996. Fish, shellfish, yams, to canned meat, salt meat, sweets, and of course the ubiquitous tobacco, smoked or dipped, that would give rise to emphysema, to two of the women who were down at Bobo with me in 1996. The bodies of those of us working on the GIS library, too, were changing. I smelled different. My colleagues smelled different, though differentially, obviously, depending on whether our teeth or toes had rotted from too many Coca-Colas, from the form of medications we were on for blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes, whether we smoked dope or drank too much, whether we reeked from chlorine from swimming, or whether we got the proper antibiotics for various kinds of infections. That is, our stinks stunk differently than our parents, and each one of us, though, again, depending on how you're governed, us differentially, stunk different than each other. And as we did, so did the fog, so did the lands. And one of the really lovely examples of this, when we were back then at Bobo afterwards, Covering and I working on, again, thinking through this GPS project, we were going to pee, and a sister of mine and I was, peeing the way one pees, and you guys know, but anyway, the bush, and she was peeing and I was peeing. We all had just had a conversation about what kind of blood pressure medicine that we were on, and she said, well, I guess this country's not going to get high blood pressure. That's the kind of, but it's the kind of like attention to the mutual becoming and the stakes of that mutual becoming, and how then, in really paying attention to not what is in a cultural way, what's human and non-human thing, but rather the forces that keep bodies as a kind of body, keep existence as a certain kind of existence. What does this have to do with these media projects? So let's return to the two digital projects. And again, and I should say, I meant to stop this section by saying, it's that attention to mutual constitution, that is, how existence are formed and stay into a form of existence. And the obligation to try and keep a form of existence existing is what the Cotabang think knowledge is for. That's what it's for. You come to know in a certain way because that coming to know in a certain way mutually constitutes you and the thing you're coming to know. And so it's not about truth. I mean, of course, there's people who know those stories truer than other people. That's certainly the case. But it's not about truth in this abstraction that governs a certain kind of Western technology, but rather the purpose of coming to know is coming to be obligated to a form of existence. It's very different, but it's, again, and it's not outside of existence. It's in existence. Existence as it exists, including blood pressure medicine, etc. So let's return to our two digital projects and ask, go back to the question is, why did we move from one to the other? Why are we going the wrong, quote, wrong way down the old media track? And here we can say, okay, what's the purpose of making these things? Whether our GPS, GIS, digital archive, which we never made really, and I can tell you why in some way. Well, I am going to tell you why. Okay. What's the purpose? And how does it as I was trying to write this for this conference, how does answering this question, what's the purpose of the new media? Trying to answer why we went from new media to old media, even if you do it like that. Instead of saying, well, what's the purpose of what we're making? How does this help us think about this question of inheriting in colonial and ecologically challenged worlds? Okay, so what's the purpose? Let's start with the GIS project. The digital archive, as I said at the beginning, was conceived as a means of maintaining this theory of knowledge. That is, it was conceived as focusing on the learning how. The learning how constitutes the world that then you're going to inherit. So how you learn is important. While it would generate money without developing or just gutting their land, which is a lot of pressure on them to do. And it was specifically oriented to engage younger members of the economy because the parents were doing what exactly this kind of learning does, which was study their kids and what seems to drive them, what were they interested in, and then taking that time turning, seducing them. And this GIS-based platform seemed a pretty perfect fit when we were thinking about it. It necessitated being in the country as a precondition of knowing it, right? So you have to supposedly be there to know it. Its interactive features would allow new information to be added relative to the shifting nature of the place and people. And they were thinking, when we talk, especially when we talk with some software designers, that software could be written that would give kids more information the more they return. So you could actually show how many times you were there, because how many times that you were able to look at it, and every time you did it, you could learn more. So it was this incentive to go more and more. Now, in fact, every dimension of this digital archive, if you looked at the digital archive as not something that was free from force, but instead as something that determines at every level how something is shaped as a condition of it moving through it. So in one hand, it was like, oh, that's cool. Like, you can use this whole technology to reinforce this particular pedagogical method. In fact, everything about the new media, the more they got into it, was like, well, wait a minute. For instance, the content of the new media is shaped by both the semantics of, so I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but it's shaped by the semantics of software and its interactive rules. An object, that is, what is an object, what's shellback? If you're going to put it into one of these programs, it has to be shaped through the concept of entity and affordances, which, again, you can think, well, that's neutral. Anything can be an entity, and you can give it any kind of affordances. But in fact, what an entity is in the software that runs these programs, especially ontological web languages, is very semantically understood. So if there's this thing that then you give qualities to, and that's really counter to the more becoming nature of this relationship between place and people and this continual becoming of it. The perspective of place, of course, is not located in this plane, but rather circuited through the God's eye view. And the content of the new media, of course, is structured by whatever the given cultural politics of recognition are circulating through the country. So the stories that can be put on and open to the public, of course, are pressured by a settler imaginary that at the time we were doing it in 2008 was being shaped by this image of the sexual, predatory, indigenous male. And so it's like, okay, well then pressure about what can circulate through there. And finally, the very green nature of the technology, that is, the economy wanted, would use this not as an alternative to mining their land. very quickly fell apart because in order to finance, and one of the things that, you know, we could go and talk to people about financing, and the financiers would say, well, can you, what's the potential growth of this technology? And we found ourselves saying, well, but everyone's going to have mobile phones soon. Everyone's going to have smart technology. All the phones are going to have GPS. And therefore, everyone's going to want to come down here into this country and do this kind of thing. You can sell it everywhere. Every place will have this. And we just saw all the world being mined in order to produce the thing that was open. There it is. Not to mention the amount of energy that goes into maintaining these huge databases, right? All the air conditioning, all the infrastructure. So one could say, well, the reason the code being shifted from this new media to this old media is they thought, well, this really doesn't make any sense. You know, but the real reason that they shifted was really more important. I think many of the economy would say, well, that's okay. It's a country in some ways. But the real reason was the younger kids didn't bite. That is, the entire project in some ways was built around this notion that, well, this will hook them into going back and doing and participating. That didn't happen because, for a number of reasons. But the point for today is it just didn't happen. They didn't reorient their excitement about the world around this potential app and the potential materials that would go on the app. And instead, stayed home, stayed in bed, stayed doing the things that parents didn't want them to do as much. And instead, by accident, one day when we were in a space like this and we were thinking together about what the content of this GPS project would be, someone suggested that maybe we could just practice making one of these we'd make a little movie that would be inside the GPS project. And suddenly all the kids showed up. Not only did they show up, they stayed all day, they stayed another day. They did things that we had never really seen them do, their parents had never seen them do. And indeed, the film collective then emerged out of the GPS project because the film project, whether old or new, wasn't really, was something that pulled the kids into participating, and that meant, since the way in which the films would be made, is that part of it had to be in the country, thinking through the country, thinking about the conditions of being in country and in relation to each other in the current way in which existence exists. That in fact, this old media was producing what we wanted to produce, and the parents wanted to produce, and the kids wanted to produce too. That is a relation of orientation vis-a-vis one another through the actual existence of the country, their country, and the world that they were living in. And what everybody noticed was that the films were not simply representing and analyzing the structure and nature of existing social conflicts, which is one of the things that I said that films were doing, is what someone notices something and then plot it. The films were keeping the country alive in the minds and bodies of their kids by acting on the country. That is, not merely making a film representing their lives in the country, but paying attention to the country as they were making a film in and about it. After a long day shooting in the bush, no one wanted to hear, "Cut, let's do it again. Cut, let's do it again." Right? Cut, over. But take after take, as conversations and arguments about what parts of their life should have precedent over other parts, the Cotabang found themselves both creating a filmic representation of an archive of their lives and actually having the conversations and the practices in lands that constitute their lives. In the act of making their films, they are making a space for themselves in the actual dusk of the impending Northern Territory build-up, actual sandflies and mosquitoes beginning to bite, an actual churning stomach and a headache in need of alleviation, actual worries about actual houses whose rent must actually be paid, as well as representing these ordinary conditions of carrying out one's obligations to others, people and country, in this colonized, ecologically challenged environment in which they actually live. If this way of inheriting helps build place into people and people into place, then the Kadabing say, this form of inheritance, old media, is the form that their practice of pedagogy will take in order to make existence that are become what they would like them to be. Thank you. I don't know, that took a little while. Should I stop? I was going to just show one clip of the, is that okay? Yeah. And this is the Kadabing had made, it depends how you count it, it's made 2 films or 3 films, because the first one, a brother of mine in particular takes credit for the whole shift in film collective too. This first one, which is actually an amalgamation of the short, and then people wanted to extend it, so we extended it into a longer 35-minute one that you can see today. This one was conceived, I would say, more by the adults. The one we just did was conceived more by the children. I can talk about teenagers, not children. I can talk more about that tonight. But this scene is really, I find really interesting because it suggests what's not what you're seeing, but maybe what was being done. And what happened here was that they're about to go up this hill where a dog dreaming is, and there's a long story to it. And the parents were like, we should take the teenagers up there. They're in the film because it's all you'll see in the film. And we should make them say the things they said when they first went there. That would be this part of the film. I was like, that's cool, let's do that. Yeah, that's everybody. So we all said, yeah, let's do that. So we go up the hill, and what you're going to see is what happened was we're all about the same age now, about 40s, adults, 40s, 50s. Really, the top is 58 because of uneven distribution of life. We're up on this hill, and we said, okay, you guys, like you said that when you were first here, you said that when you were first here, you said that, so you go first, second, third, like that. And you guys say it like that, and then just keep going. So we turned on the camera, and they said, and then they looked at us and said, now what? And we said, keep going. Just keep how would you answer each other? And then they started having this conversation. And we just sat there and kind of let it go, and then we cut it. And what you don't see, everything was done, because of course he edited, but something happened in the moment that's not characterizable. It just, and that's part of what's in it. So anyways, that's just it's a couple minutes. If I can make it work. Where's the play?
this shit now, all the things but I want to eat comedy. But if he ate his everywhere thing, instead of sitting there like a dumb person. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, you were close to make me laugh. They will get oh my God. It's not funny, it's real. It's real.
It was right when Shuri Jane said, who was the woman that the teenager that left there, who said, it's real, it's real. No, again, that's the force that the economy want to instill in there. Oh, where am I going? Okay, thank you.
So I think we'll take a few questions. Anybody have any questions?
Thanks so much for that interesting talk. I love your work. It makes me think a lot about, I work with reenactment and thinking about reenactment. And as I was watching this scene, they're kind of reenacting their previous experiences, and it was making me think about the work of Carrie Mae Weems. Are you familiar with her work? So,
I'm actually not a film person. I read drag movies too.
So one of the things she's done with her students in the States is have them reenact famous historical photographs as a way to sort of re-embody these famous moments of American history, like civil rights movement stuff, as a way for them to kind of understand the way she talks about the history that they come from and how we all inhabit the outcome of that history. And I find it a really powerful way to think about how reenactment creates sort of possibility. Anyways, all of that is to say, like, have you thought about this sort of way that this is getting played out through the idea of reenactment? And how their reenactment like creates a new social space? So I was thinking about that in terms of social art too, like.
Yeah, I mean, these things that we talk about, because we really do talk about these things together. I mean, it's, and we're making together. One of the things that they talk about often is when, like, genre is not a word that, it's a word that Kadri are learning, but it wasn't initially the kind of word they would use. They would say, but they would say, so people would say, well, are these documentaries? And it was like, well, no, it's like these things happen. But we want to tell a story about what actually happens to see this. But when they're making it, it's the commentary. Wow, this isn't a story. It's not fiction. This is real. This is actually what happens. So you're playing yourself, but in a way that one has to think about what oneself is doing. And there's Boalian traditions, but there's also these logocotomy modes of performing that are all about that, right? And I'm not going to say a little bit more of that, but absolutely, the reenactment is part of the work of the film, but it's not, no one worries about exactly reenacted. It's not like here's a historical thing. Those kids, the other things they said, I mean, we went in a circle, and they said it at different times, and they weren't all in a circle around the hole necessarily. But again, the point of reenacting is it's indeed to, and the form of move making of this type that they want to make, which means do it again, you got to move the camera, do it again, move the camera. Builds, it reenacts and builds the thing into them and then back into the computer. That's what they say. Yeah. So yeah, the neorealism. I'm not, what we call this now. I'm not sure, but the neorealism is absolutely part of it. So the film we just finished shooting, the teenagers authored, and they wanted it to be about stealing. stealing that in the movie turned out not to be stealing. That is, them going to jail for stealing cartons of beer while all around the country being mined all over the place. And so the mining part came in from the parents and some of the people who worked as rangers. The stealing part came with the kids, and then all of the sections of the economy kind of had to weave these narratives together, all around things that actually happened in various ways to people. Yeah. If that's answering the question. And then allowing for these experiences to happen.
And like the transformation. I think a lot about that transformation through reenactment.
Sure, they talks about that. Like whenever we watch this together, everyone's like, you know, it's real, it's real. And the whole look at Sherry Jane, she said, and people said, what was it? And she said, I don't know. But it happened, right? So that opening really happened. And one of what the kids say, we'll never forget that story. Just go over and over, never forget that story. Yeah.
There's a question.
Something Elizabeth, this is great. I think this is an empathetic question about the risks of, again, similar to the question that I asked before, of grafting a different metaphysics into metaphysics that we understand.
Right.
So how we are theorizing this then fits what our own theorizations. I'm thinking here about the limits of enlightenment myths of subjectivity, knowledge, and materiality even, and thinking about maybe the possibility of theorizing relationships mediated by something other than knowledge, identity, or understanding. So what have you thought about it?
Well, part of, again, I think yesterday's conversation around the characterization of even the counter epistemologies that we can, the Deleuzian assemblage, gritty deconstruction, Codian genealogy, all of which, in some ways I've also grown up with, absolutely are twofold, two aspects. One is that they're absolutely turning in on the epistemology out of which they come. But it would be wrong to think that they themselves haven't been pressured by what exists outside of them. And I think that's actually really important, is that we grant the counter epistemologies the same kind of integrity and sovereignty that the non-counter epistemologies claim for themselves when we don't really acknowledge is that they're being pressured by an incompleteness of thought that's coming from somewhere else. Yeah. At the same time, and part of I think and a lot of what I do, I should say, is really work from the very old relationships that I have in Australia. I turn and I look at Western epistemologies and Western practices of governance and turn on them kind of from there, but not in an old-fashioned, like their epistemology. It's more, so it's working inside and against. And that's what I do, because actually because I do think that late liberalism uses culture as a mode of governance, I'm very loath, and have always been very loath, to describe the cultural other. I mean, that's part of that governance. What the film project that Povinelli are doing is really interesting, because I think it's a mode of them also developing their own languages, filmic languages and aesthetic forms that are not removed, because they're not outside even. They don't think they're outside. But as another way, and again, the parallel I think that we were talking about yesterday is parallel critiques that can then maybe put it into conversation with each other, though I don't know what the conversation will be yet. So it's doing that double work at the same time. And trying to be really, of course, trying to be attentive at the captures. Quick capture. You try and go this way, it captures it. Try and go that way, captures it. How how to really work about that.
Or maybe also about our blindness and deafness to what is unintelligible to our senses.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's like, I mean, my colleague Audra Simpson talks about this is quite very austere ethnography, and it was really the nicest thing that someone said, because it was like, yeah, because there's a hard way of trying to not allow that intelligibility, because that allows. And hopefully you see in the film, like the story about the dog breed is kind of there and kind of not, right? So it doesn't give you this intelligible story that then you can focus on. Tries to focus on other things like barbed wire, planes that as they're trying to get to this place that find them, broken cars, the bureaucratic state that's regulating. So it really puts that in forward